So originally when the idea of this workshop had been mooted, I was thinking of a lot of different sort of high-end applications of probability to things. I was thinking of some of the criteria that have been offered for the authenticity of a historical event, and maybe I could model some of those probabilistically. I was thinking of arguments from silence. I've had a paper come out recently on that. There's some really interesting material to be done on that. I'm happy to talk, sort of out of school about any of those things. But as we were talking with people at this conference that's just terminated on special divine action, educated people who have degrees and have thought about this and care about these issues, there are a number of mere slogans that kept surfacing over and over. And John and I were talking about this as we were sort of in the final planning stages for this, and John said, I really think you need to say something about this, because even though it lies in some sense at the threshold of the discussion, it is just enormously powerful. It holds sway over the minds of these people, and it's going to be a barrier to their appreciating the application of this sort of thing at all. So I thought I'd do a couple of those, and the first one that I wanted to do is to do with the first part of the title here, which is extraordinary claims. There's a very famous television presenter and personality in the United States of a previous generation, Carl Sagan, who loved to make the claim over and over that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so I'd like to take that as my point of entry, and in his honor, I'll call it the argumentum Sagani. Trouble is, that slogan is mostly the end of a discussion and not the beginning of one, right? It's brought in to terminate what might otherwise be a fruitful conversation. And I'm much afraid that it runs like this. I wish I could take a responsibility for this, but some other genius who is anonymous has put this up on the internet. I think it runs something like this. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The claim that God exists, or substitute Jesus rose from the dead, is extraordinary. Therefore, any evidence supporting it ought to be extraordinary as well. I'm not sure what I mean by extraordinary, but whatever you come up with, it's not going to work. Therefore, God does not exist. And I'm sorry to say that I think this is actually approximately what's in the mind of some of the people who throw this slogan around. Can we do better? Well, what exactly does extraordinary mean? It can't mean merely unprecedented. As Richard pointed out during the conference, every event, if you define it in sufficient detail, is unprecedented. It is unprecedented that exactly this group of people should be sitting in this room at St. Anne's listening to a colloquium on probability in the resurrection of Jesus. It has never happened before, and it will probably never happen that all of us gather in exactly this room again. Sure, we get into that nitty-gritty level. On the other hand, people coming to listen to talks, well, yes, all the time. So a lot depends on the level of generality or specificity with which you describe the particular event. So here's a better try. An extraordinary event is an event that belongs to a natural type or kind of events that are intrinsically rare, such as miracles. I think that we could finesse that. I'm not trying to claim that that should be sort of an end try, but I do think that it's better than merely unprecedented, because that just gets you into all kinds of trouble. And again, if you get beyond the slogan itself, some kind of appeal to the unprecedentedness of the event is usually as far as you get. So I'm going to try to do better, in a sense, try to help the other side to make their own criticism sharper and then to discuss it. So how do we get from rare to improbable? And the trouble is that rare events occur. We know this. So let's try this. If X is a rare sort of event, and if that is all that we know about it, then the claim that X has occurred at such and such a time in such and such a place may be, relative to our slender base of evidence, because this is all that we know, it's a rare type of event, improbable. For the sake of the argument, I'm willing to go with that, but notice how thin that is, because it's got this crucial claim. If that is all that we know about it, and the entire point of trying to do a Bayesian analysis is that you try to bring in more evidence. You're trying to, well, how does this affect our rational judgment of the claim? We don't just camp on our initial assessment of things. We never do that. We don't do that in history. We don't, oh wow, here's a French king who had an opportunity to seize a mill from its peasant owner. And I'm told he didn't do it. That kind of restraint in a monarch with that sort of power is very rare, maybe unprecedented. But the historical evidence persuades me that it did. I look at certain scientific theories. Wow, these would be very odd, and maybe they would have causal mechanisms that would belong to types that are rare, and yet sufficient evidence comes in, we find ourselves believing these things. So I don't think that we can take antecedent improbability as being a showstopper. I'll talk more about showstoppers in a minute. So here's a slogan from Hume's famous essay of miracles that I think lies behind and motivates to some extent the use of Sagan's slogan. No testimony, Hume says, is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. I take it, most commentators do take it, that more miraculous is a bit of a rhetorical flourish. That what Hume really means is even less probable. So here's a Bayesian reconstruction, trying to follow what Hume was saying. The probability of a miracle, given the testimony we've got, is greater than the probability the miracle didn't happen, again, given the testimony we've got, only if the probability of the miracle is greater than the probability of getting the testimony, supposing that the miracle did not, in fact, occur. So, just parsing out what the terms mean there, that is not the theorem of the probability calculus. However, it's an approximation. The exact inequality would look like this on the one side, but if we assume that both the probability that the miracle didn't occur and the probability of the testimony, supposing that it did occur, are close to 1, then the approximation that I had on the previous slide, I'll put that up again, falls out as a fairly good approximation. Yeah, we use the words only if, strictly speaking, we're fudging a bit because we're approximating. But under the terms of that approximation, it's not bad, and it gives us something that we can look at and say, well, all right, perhaps this is where Hume's going, and if so, he's playing a little fast and loose, but let's be generous. Let's give him some rope, see if he can hang himself with it. Let's allow him that he's not really far off track, if that's his approximation, if that's where he's going. But here's what the approximation can't do. It can't answer the question of whether in any particular application the probability of the testimonial evidence, supposing the miracle had not happened, really is less than or greater than the probability of the miracle. Probability theory, and this is very much in line with formal deductive logic, it can give structure to our debates, and it can help to focus our disagreements, but it can't settle the substantive issues. It's a tool. It's not something that's sort of going to settle the entire debate, and so I don't think any sensible person working in this thinks that probability theory comes in and answers the substantive questions. It all depends on your inputs. Right? They're the old garbage in, garbage out statement, and so we have to worry about and think about and be careful about the inputs that we give. So here's extraordinary evidence, Bayesian style. You'd say E is strong evidence for some hypothesis H, if and only if, and to the extent that, so this will give us a way of putting a measure on it as well as just a sort of flat definition. The probability of the evidence, supposing the hypothesis to be true, is much greater than the probability of the evidence, supposing the hypothesis to be false. Or, if you like to just take these things and put them into a ratio, that ratio is very top-heavy, much, much greater than 1. So we could try reconstructing Hume's maxim this way. If the probability of H is very low, then the probability of E given H over the probability of E given not H must be very high if the ultimate probability of H once we've taken this evidence E into account. And I'm just suppressing background knowledge K because it appears everywhere here and would just clutter the equations. But if that's to exceed 0.5 and the prior is very low, then this ratio needs to be quite high in order to counterbalance that. There's a stricter formulation of that that will be of interest only to those who already know it. There's a problem with this reconstruction. If we formulate the principle simply in terms of H and E, it makes it seem like E has to be a single, spectacular, extraordinary piece of evidence. We occasionally do have spectacular evidence for hypotheses, but much more frequently, we don't have a single fantastic piece of evidence, even though our total evidence may be very good. So we often don't have an extraordinary piece of evidence. Well, how can we sort of overcome this problem? Here's where I think we should go to cumulative cases, and this is the other part of my title here. We need to be able to represent the impact of multiple pieces of evidence, not just a single piece. And so for this, the proper formula looks a bit like the ratio we had before, but now you'll notice something. It's not just E, it's E1 and E2 and all the way down to En. It's a whole collection of pieces taken on the top relative to H and on the bottom, supposing not H. And the idea is this total thing has to be quite top heavy. So now, we've got a conjunction, E1 and E2 and E3 and En. We've got another conjunction. So all we have to do is assign probabilities to those conjunctions, and we have a problem. And here's the problem. There's ample documentation. I put a little bit of it in here, and don't try to take notes. I'll give it to you later if you want. Humans are prone to overestimate the probability of a conjunction vis-a-vis the probability of the conjuncts when we've got the probability of a conjunction being all terms lower than 1, normally not asymptotically approaching 1, significantly lower than 1. We don't multiply very well on the fly. When we're on the wing, we tend to make shoot-from-the-hip judgments that are really quite poor. So what this leads to is a sort of probabilistic fallacy of composition. None of these numbers is very great or very small. Therefore, their product is not very great or very small. There's no interesting definition of great or of small for which this claim is true. That really just is a fallacy in probabilistic reasoning and an instance of a sort of fallacy of composition that's well known from other logic textbooks. And in this case, I think it's a very vicious fallacy of composition. Let me give you an example of this. So, math whizzes like Calum are exempted from this one. But here's a sort of experiment that's been done in the cognitive psych and empirical psychology literature. 2 outwardly identical bags contain 100 marbles each. One of them has 75 red and 25 green. The other, just the reverse, 75 green, 25 red. And you can establish that condition by counting through the bags, if you like, ab initio. But you select a bag at random, right? I switch them around, you don't know which one is which, and you get a bag. And you get to draw with replacement. So you draw a marble out, you check its color, you put it right back in the same bag, and we shake it up. Then you can draw again. So the composition of the bag is not changing from one draw to the next. And you get a sort of a mishmash, green, red, green, red, red, green, red, 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 green, red, red, green. For those of you who don't like to count, I think that's 8 reds and 5 greens. Your evidence is mixed, right? There's some of each. There's more reds than there are greens, 8 to 5. What's the probability given this information from those 11 samples that you've taken that you selected the mostly red bag? Initially, you picked a bag at random. So initially it was 50-50, right? But now you've got some evidence which, because of the preponderance of red in there, should incline you a bit more onto the red side. How much? I do this example in my classes when I teach probability theory, and I let my students go ahead and have a shot at it. I say, look, don't calculate, shoot from the hip. Tell me what you think. And I get, maybe it's moved up to 60%. Some people, I don't know, maybe 70%. Some people start trying to divide 8 by 13 to see what that proportion comes out to, and they use that number that they come up with. Do that for yourself. Think to yourself. You don't have to say anything, right? You know, I'm not going to say every head bowed, every eye closed, raise your hand. But think it out, and we'll come back to that at the end. So, take it as read that we have a problem assessing conjunctions of evidence. What do? I think the answer is we anatomize the evidence. We break it down. We look at the first piece of the evidence relative to the hypothesis and its negation. Then we look at the second piece of evidence relative to the hypothesis and the first piece, and relative to the negation and the first piece, and so on, until we get this really clumsy looking thing down at the end, and somehow, when I was trying to put these in, these things came out looking like underscores where they should have been the minus signs. I apologize, that should be n-1 here and here. So I'm just 2 o'clock typing. It doesn't work, trust me. Or if we can assume independence, we can clear out some of the mess in those just by putting up the individual Bayes factors. Whether we can assume independence is always a tricky question. We can't in general assume it. When it breaks down, it might break down positively or negatively. Great set of questions, not trying to go there. We anatomize like that. There's still no guarantee that the probabilities are accurate. Here, I would just say there's no substitute for good judgment. There's no substitute for phronesis. You still need that. However, we have circumvented one known source of cognitive bias in the weighing of evidence. That's all that I'm claiming for the process of anatomizing it. But the upshot of this is that anything that could in principle be done with a single spectacular piece of evidence, extraordinary evidence, can be done by the accumulation of smaller, less spectacular pieces of evidence. And there's a wonderful quote from Gladstone, which I thought, since I'm here in England, I would take the opportunity to remind you all of. He says, "There is no limit to the strength of working, as distinguished from abstract certainty, to which probable evidence may not lead us along its gently ascending paths." And it's really, he's saying the same thing that I'm saying. We're talking about an accumulation of pieces of evidence, not just one single spectacular piece. Well, you get that far in a conversation, you've been very fortunate, but then, if you're like me, you're going to encounter the showstopper. And here's the showstopper. Any naturalistic explanation must be better than every non-naturalistic explanation. Right? You guys have a supernatural explanation, therefore you lose. How many of you have heard some variant on that? Right, right, just about everyone has encountered this. I want to draw attention to just a couple of things, and I'm nearing the end, so don't fear, I'm aware that tea is coming very shortly. First of all, this protest has nothing to do with the evidence. This is a complaint that is directed at the prior probabilities. And it is very difficult, once you sit down and actually try, to tease out a compelling line of argument for it. So, for example, what lies behind this showstopper? I think, at best, it's something like this. Naturalistic explanations invoke only entities of a sort we know, on independent grounds, to exist. Non-naturalistic explanations invoke at least one entity of a sort we do not know, on independent grounds, to exist. Whenever we're faced with a choice between something we know independently to be true and something we do not independently know to be true, we should always prefer the former. Therefore, we should always prefer a naturalistic explanation to any non-naturalistic explanation. I'm not trying to be unfair. I'm actually trying to see if I can unpack this to the best of my ability. And I think this is an absolutely terrible argument. For one thing, the inference is simply invalid. We're not choosing simply among the hypotheses as we come to them ab initio. We're trying to choose among them in the light of the data. And the showstopper is dealing entirely with those prior probabilities. Well, what if we try to change some of the premises? And they're just, I think, they're horrible, and you can see this by trying to expand them, right? Whenever we are faced with a choice between something we know independently to be true, no matter how poorly it explains the further evidence we have gathered, and something we do not independently know to be true, no matter how simple, elegant, and fruitful the supposition proves, we should always prefer the former. Does that seem as compelling as the initial formulation of the premise? But this is where it has to go in order to yield any interesting conclusion. you can't get the conclusion that's wanted out of the showstopper unless you fill out the premises in ways that I think are just patently false. I can't imagine why anyone thoughtful would be induced to believe them. So here's the final moral, and because I love old books, I'm going to quote to you something from 1729. This is from Thomas Sherlock's Trial of the Witnesses of the Resurrection. His protagonist in the Trial of the Witnesses says, "I do allow that in this case, and others of like nature, require more evidence to give them credit than ordinary cases do. You may therefore require more evidence in these than in other cases. But it is absurd to say that such cases admit no evidence when the things in question are quite manifestly objects of sense." And it's 10:30. Thank you.
Would you be willing to take questions over tea?
Sure, absolutely. Let's do it.
Let's take our break. We have tea not in the tent, but in the dining hall, I believe. So we can do that, and we will reconvene here to start at 11.
Very good.